Every superpower runs on money. Armies march, roads are paved, hospitals open, and pensions are paid. Not on promises, but on dollars. And for the United States, that bill keeps growing. Today, America's national debt has soared past $34 trillion, a figure so large it's almost impossible to picture. If every dollar were a second, $34 trillion seconds would stretch back more than 1,000,000 years. More alarming? The cost of simply paying interest on that debt has now surpassed what America spends on national defense. In other words, the U.S. government spends more servicing old loans than funding the most powerful military on Earth. How did we get here? Decades of wars, tax cuts, economic crises, and emergency spending all layered onto the national balance sheet. From the Great Recession to the COVID-19 pandemic, every shock carried a price tag. One future generations must pay. But this isn't just about numbers in Washington. The debt shapes the economy we all live in. It can affect inflation, the strength of the dollar, the security of Social Security checks, and the interest rates on your mortgage or student loan. In this video, we'll unpack it all. Where the federal government spends its trillions, how the debt grew to historic levels, and what it means for America's future at home and abroad. Because every dollar borrowed today is not just an entry in a ledger, it's a bill passed down to our children and to theirs. Before we can understand how America fell into debt, we need to look at where the money actually goes. In 2024, the federal budget topped $6.5 trillion, the largest checkbook in the world. Imagine holding a single federal dollar. Here's how it's spent. Social Security, 20 cents. Monthly checks to over 70 million retirees, survivors, and the disabled. Healthcare, Medicare plus Medicaid, back 28 cents. Doctor visits for seniors, care for low-income families, and hospital funding. Defense, back 13 cents. Bases, troops, carriers, cyber defense, veterans benefits. Interest on debt, back 11 cents, more than America spends on its military. Education plus infrastructure, under 10 cents combined. Highways, bridges, schools, student aid, everything else. Agriculture, law enforcement, science, disaster relief. Here's the problem. Most of the budget isn't negotiable. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, and interest eat up nearly 80% of spending. That leaves little flexibility for new priorities unless more money is borrowed. When critics talk about cutting waste, the truth is that most federal spending is locked into obligations people depend on. That's why trimming the budget is far harder than campaign speeches suggest. This is the scale of America's purse, massive, indispensable, and already stretched thin. Once you see where each dollar goes, the question becomes clear. If so much is locked in, how did the debt balloon so high? America's debt story is a slow build, decade by decade. After World War II, debt topped 100% of GDP, but explosive post-war growth shrank the burden. By the 1970s, it was below 35%. The lesson seemed clear. Grow fast enough, and yesterday's debts fade. Then came the 1980s. President Ronald Reagan cut taxes while ramping up Cold War defense spending. Geopolitically, the strategy worked. Financially, it entrenched deficits as a permanent feature. The 2000s added more weight. President George W. Bush cut taxes again and launched wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Lower revenue plus higher costs sent deficits soaring. Then 2008 hit. The financial crash triggered bailouts and stimulus packages. Debt surged, but leaders argued the alternative was collapse. Just as recovery began, the COVID-19 pandemic unleashed another tidal wave. Trillions in relief were necessary to keep businesses alive and families afloat. But the cost rivaled decades of prior borrowing. Today, debt exceeds $34 trillion, with a debt-to-GDP ratio rivaling World War II levels. But unlike the post-war boom, modern growth isn't shrinking the burden. The message is unavoidable. America's debt isn't the result of one crisis, one president, or one party. It's the accumulation of choices across generations: wars, tax cuts, rescues, pandemics. a layered legacy, and a bill still waiting to be paid. Nearly half the federal budget goes to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. For seniors, these programs are lifelines: the Social Security check that pays rent, the Medicare card that makes doctor visits possible. For low-income families, Medicaid is often the only barrier against medical bankruptcy. But behind those lifelines is a fiscal storm. 10,000 baby boomers retire every day. Costs rise as the workforce paying into the system shrinks. The Social Security Trust Fund is projected to run dry by 2033. Without action, benefits could be cut 20%. Medicare faces a similar crunch as healthcare costs climb. Options spark fierce fights. Raise retirement age, trim benefits, increase taxes on the wealthy. None are politically safe, but ignoring the math risks breaking promises to millions. The safety net isn't just a budget item, it's a moral test, and one of Washington's toughest choices. America spends nearly $900 billion a year on defense, more than the next 10 nations combined. That pays for global bases, fleets of carriers, cutting-edge jets, nuclear deterrence, cyber defense, and long-term veterans benefits. Supporters call it the backbone of U.S. power, protecting trade, allies, and deterrence against rivals like China and Russia. Critics argue it's overreach, America policing the world while roads and schools at home crumble. Either way, the defense budget keeps climbing, and every dollar spent abroad is one less available for challenges at home. Interest on the national debt now exceeds defense spending. Over $1 trillion this year will go not to programs or people, but to creditors. Why? Two reasons: massive debt and higher interest rates. Every dollar borrowed is more expensive than it was a decade ago. Think of it like a family drowning in credit card bills. More of the paycheck goes to past purchases, leaving less for today. Washington faces the same squeeze. Economists warn interest is the fastest growing part of the budget. Unless spending slows or revenues rise, the U.S. will spend more on yesterday than tomorrow. Where does the money come from? Income taxes, about half of all federal revenue. Payroll taxes, about a third, funding Social Security and Medicare. Corporate taxes, less than 10% after decades of rate cuts and loopholes. Other streams, tariffs, excise taxes, estate taxes. Since the Reagan era, tax cuts have reshaped revenue. Reagan, Bush, and Trump all cut deeply, arguing it spurred growth. Critics say it starved the government while costs soared. The system is progressive. Higher earners pay higher rates, but payroll taxes are regressive, hitting lower incomes harder, and loopholes let billionaires pay lower effective rates than teachers. The debate remains: do Americans pay too much, or does Washington collect too little? Debt makes for easy villains. Republicans blame government overspending and unsustainable entitlements. Democrats blame tax cuts for the wealthy and corporate loopholes. The truth? Both sides added to the problem. Republicans cut revenue but expanded defense. Democrats expanded social programs without matching tax hikes. Bailouts and stimulus had bipartisan fingerprints. Debt isn't red or blue, it's bipartisan. America's collective inheritance and collective responsibility. The debt ceiling is a recurring time bomb. In 2011, partisan standoffs triggered America's first-ever credit downgrade. In 2023, Washington again came close to default. Each time, markets shook, investors panicked, and ordinary Americans worried about missed Social Security checks. A single missed payment could trigger global panic. That's why brinkmanship isn't just politics. It's playing chicken with the world economy. National debt sounds abstract until it reaches the kitchen table. Higher borrowing costs mean pricier mortgages, student loans, and credit cards. Families feel it directly in monthly payments. Inflation risk makes groceries and gas more expensive. And when interest eats more of the budget, funding for education, healthcare, and veterans shrinks. The national debt may sound like Washington jargon, but it's a lived reality for seniors, students, and families across America. Other nations offer lessons. Japan. Debt to GDP double America's, but stable because markets trust it. Greece, debt spiral after 2008, forced into austerity. The U.S. survives on one advantage: the dollar as global reserve currency. Nations buy U.S. bonds as safe assets, keeping borrowing cheap. But if trust in America falters, borrowing costs could soar, and the safety net could vanish. The CBO project's debt could hit 180% of GDP by 2050. The options: raise taxes on wealthy and corporations, trim entitlements like Social Security and Medicare, cut defense, grow economy faster than debt. Each path is politically explosive, but ignoring the problem risks leaving future generations cornered. Every dollar borrowed today is a debt to tomorrow. Debt isn't just economic, it's moral. Will we hand the next generation opportunity or only bills? The national debt reflects wars fought, promises made, crises endured. Each administration adds layers, and the bill never disappears. The question isn't whether America can spend, it's whether it can afford the cost of inaction. Here at Politics Unpacked, we'll keep breaking down the numbers and the stakes.